The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty town of Copper Springs, Arizona territory, as Jake Morrison clutched 5 crumpled dollar bills in his weathered hand. Around him, the crowd jeered and pointed at the figure on the auction block, a woman whose face was hidden beneath a burlap sack, her Apache heritage evident in her traditional dress and the way she held herself with quiet dignity despite her circumstances. The auctioneer's voice cut through the scorching air like a blade, announcing lot after lot of undesirable merchandise that nobody wanted. But when Jake's eyes met the woman's through the rough holes cut in that sack, something stirred in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. He had no idea that this moment would change both their lives forever, or that beneath that sack lay a story of survival, betrayal, and a beauty that would make him weep not from horror, but from the overwhelming realization that sometimes the most precious things come disguised as the most broken. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jake Morrison had been running from his past for 3 years, but you can't outrun loneliness on the Arizona frontier. It follows you like a shadow, growing longer with each sunset and deeper with each dawn. At 28, he looked 40. His face carved by desert winds and marked by losses that had aged him beyond his years. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw wasn't the worst of his wounds. Those were the invisible ones that kept him awake at night, staring at the ceiling of whatever boarding house would take his money. The cattle ranch where he worked as a hand stretched across thousands of acres of unforgiving desert, owned by a man named Charles Whitmore, who treated his workers like the livestock they tended. Jake had drifted there 6 months ago, another nameless cowboy looking for work and a place to forget. The other hands called him Silent Jake because he rarely spoke unless spoken to, and even then, his responses were measured and brief. They didn't know about the wife he'd lost back in Kansas, about the farm that had burned down with her inside it, about the drinking that had followed and the fights that had driven him west into this wasteland of redemption, the town of Copper Springs squatted in the valley like a collection of weathered bones, its single main street lined with establishments that served the basic needs of men who had little use for civilization's finer offerings. Murphy's Saloon anchored one end of the street, while the general store and boarding house bookended the other. In between stood the blacksmith shop, the doctor's office, and the small jail that rarely held anyone for more than a night. It was the kind of place where people came to disappear, and Jake had been disappearing quite successfully until the morning everything changed. He'd ridden into town that scorching Tuesday in late August to collect supplies for the ranch, the same routine he'd performed dozens of times before. The heat was oppressive even for Arizona, the kind that made horses lethargic and men short-tempered. The usual crowd of drifters, merchants, and locals had gathered in the shade of the general store's awning, seeking relief from the relentless sun. That's when he'd heard the commotion from the town square. "Special auction today, folks." The auctioneer was calling out, his voice carrying across the dusty street. "Clearing out some items that need new homes. Some livestock, some tools, and a few other pieces that might interest the right buyer." Jake had initially paid little attention. Auctions were common enough in frontier towns, usually featuring the possessions of people who died, moved on, or run out of money. But as he loaded flour and beans into his saddlebags, he noticed the crowd growing larger and more animated. Curiosity, that dangerous companion of lonely men, drew him toward the square. The auction block had been set up in the center of town, a raised platform that gave everyone a clear view of the proceedings. The auctioneer, a thin man with a pencil, mustache and predatory eyes, was working his way through a collection of farm tools and household goods. Jake watched with mild interest as plows, harnesses, and furniture changed hands for modest sums. The crowd was typical for such events: ranchers looking for bargains, town merchants seeking inventory, and the usual collection of onlookers who had nothing better to do on a hot afternoon. Then the mood shifted. Jake felt it before he understood it, a change in the crowd's energy that made the hair on his arms stand up despite the heat. The auctioneer's voice took on a different tone, simultaneously apologetic and excited. "Now, folks, we come to some special items. I know this ain't the usual sort of thing, but these are unusual times, and we've got unusual merchandise. The territorial government has asked us to dispose of some native prisoners who've been causing problems for local settlers." Jake's stomach tightened. He'd heard rumors about such auctions in other towns, but he'd hoped they were just that, rumors. The practice of selling Native Americans into indentured servitude was technically illegal, but widely ignored by authorities who had little interest in protecting Apache rights. "First up," the auctioneer continued, "we have a young Apache male. Probably good for field work if you can break him of his savage ways. Do I hear $10? Jake watched in sick fascination as a 20-year-old Apache man was brought onto the platform in chains. The young man's face was a mask of barely controlled rage, his dark eyes scanning the crowd with the intensity of a trapped animal looking for escape. He was purchased by a local rancher for $15, led away like livestock to whatever fate awaited him. "Next item," the auctioneer announced, "is a bit more challenging. Apache female. Age unknown, but probably in her 20s. Fair warning, folks, she's damaged goods. Been through a fire, face all scarred up. That's why she's wearing the sack. Some might say it's a kindness. Keeps folks from having to look at what's underneath." Jake's breath caught in his throat as the woman was led onto the platform. She moved with a grace that seemed impossible given her circumstances, her head held high despite the degradation of her situation. The burlap sack that covered her head was roughly sewn, with holes cut for her eyes and mouth. Her traditional Apache dress was worn but clean, and her hands, the only part of her visible, were steady and strong. "Now, I won't lie to you," the auctioneer continued, warming to his pitch. "This one's been nothing but trouble. Won't work, won't cooperate, barely eats. The soldiers who brought her in said she was found living alone in the desert, half dead. From exposure. Probably ran away from her tribe because of her condition, but she's young and strong, and with the right hand, she might be trained to do simple tasks. Kitchen work, maybe, where nobody has to look at her." The crowd's reaction was a mixture of curiosity and revulsion. Jake could hear the whispered comments, the cruel jokes, the casual dehumanization that turned a living person into an object of derision, but what struck him most was the woman's posture. Despite everything, the chains, the sack, the jeering crowd, she stood straight and proud, as if she were a queen surveying her subjects rather than a prisoner being sold to the highest bidder. "Starting bid is $2, the auctioneer called. "Come on, folks, $2 for a strong back and willing hands. Think of it as an investment in your future prosperity." Silence. Jake watched as the crowd shifted uncomfortably, nobody willing to start the bidding on what they clearly saw as damaged goods. The woman's head turned slightly, and Jake caught a glimpse of her eyes through the holes in the sack. They were dark and intelligent, filled with a pain that he recognized from his own mirror. But there was something else there too, a spark of defiance that all the cruelty in the world hadn't been able to extinguish. $1. The auctioneer tried again, desperation creeping into his voice. "Surely someone can use a pair of hands for $1? Still nothing. Jake felt his heart pounding in his chest, a rhythm that seemed to match the woman's steady breathing. He thought about his own brokenness, his own scars, his own exile from the world of decent people. Who was he to judge someone else's damage? 50 cents, the auctioneer called, his voice cracking slightly. "Come on, folks, 50 cents for ... $5. The words came out of Jake's mouth before he'd consciously decided to speak them. The crowd turned to stare at him, surprise and speculation written on their faces. The woman's head turned toward him as well, and he felt the weight of her gaze like a physical thing. $5. The auctioneer repeated, relief flooding his voice. I have $5 from the gentleman in the back. That's quite generous, sir. Do I hear 6? The crowd was silent, clearly thinking that $5 was far too much for what they saw as worthless merchandise. Jake felt his heart hammering against his ribs, part of him hoping someone would outbid him, part of him terrified that they would. Going once, going twice. Sold to the gentleman for $5. The gavel came down with a sound like a gunshot, and Jake Morrison found himself the owner of another human being. The irony wasn't lost on him. Man who'd been running from responsibility for 3 years had just taken on the ultimate responsibility. As he walked toward the platform to complete the transaction, his mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. What was he going to do with her? Where would she live? How could he look at himself in the mirror, knowing he'd participated in something so fundamentally wrong? The woman watched him approach with those intelligent eyes, and Jake found himself wondering what she was thinking. Did she see him as another oppressor, another white man who would use her for his own purposes? Or could she somehow sense, as he was beginning to sense, that this moment was not an ending but a beginning? The auctioneer handed Jake a bill of sale, a piece of paper that legally made the woman his property. Jake stared at the document, his hand trembling slightly as he held it. Behind him, the crowd was already dispersing, moving on to other entertainment now that the spectacle was over. But for Jake Morrison, standing in that dusty square with $5 less in his pocket and a lifetime of questions ahead of him, the real story was just beginning. He approached the woman slowly, the way he might approach a wounded animal, with respect, caution, and genuine concern. When he was close enough to speak without the crowd overhearing, he found his voice. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice hoarse from the desert heat and the enormity of what he'd just done. "My name is Jake Morrison. I know this situation is." He trailed off, realizing that there were no words for what this situation was. How do you explain to someone that you've just bought their freedom by participating in their enslavement? How do you promise that things will be different when you're not even sure what different means? The woman tilted her head slightly, studying him through the eye holes in the sack. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong, accented but perfectly understandable. Why? She asked simply. It was the question Jake had been asking himself, and he realized he didn't have a good answer. Why had he spent $5 he couldn't afford on a woman he didn't know? Why had he involved himself in something that went against every principle he'd been raised with? Why had he looked into her eyes and seen something that made him act without thinking? "I don't know," he admitted, and the honesty in his voice seemed to surprise them both. "I just I couldn't let them Couldn't let them what?" She pressed, and Jake could hear a lifetime of disappointment in her voice. "Couldn't let them sell me for less than I was worth? Couldn't let them give me away? Or couldn't let them see that maybe I was worth more than they thought?" The questions hit Jake like physical blows, each one more accurate than the last. He realized that this woman, despite everything she'd been through, had his number in ways that he was only beginning to understand. She wasn't just damaged goods to be pitied. She was someone with her own thoughts, her own pain, her own strength. "All of that," he said finally. "And maybe I saw something in you that I recognize in myself." The woman was quiet for a long moment, her head tilted as if she were weighing his words. Around them, the town was settling back into its normal rhythm, but Jake felt as if his entire world had shifted on its axis. "What happens now?" she asked. Jake looked at the bill of sale in his hand, then at the woman who was somehow both his property and his equal, his responsibility and his salvation. He thought about the empty cabin where he lived alone, about the ranch where he worked for a man who saw people as resources to be used. He thought about his dead wife, about the farm that had burned, about the 3 years of running that had brought him to this moment. "Now," he said, crumpling the bill of sale into a ball and letting it fall to the dusty ground, "we figure out what comes next. Together." The woman's posture shifted slightly, and Jake could swear he saw her shoulders relax just a fraction. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something. A willingness to see what this strange, scarred cowboy might offer that was different from everything else she'd endured. As they walked away from the auction block together, Jake Morrison realized that for the first time in 3 years, he wasn't running from something. He was walking toward it, one uncertain step at a time, with a woman whose face he'd never seen, but whose eyes had already changed everything. He thought he knew about himself and the world around him. The desert sun continued to beat down on Copper Springs, but somehow the heat didn't seem quite as oppressive anymore. And in the distance, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, promising change for a land that had seen too much pain and too little hope. Jake Morrison and the woman with the covered face walked toward whatever future awaited them. Both damaged, both alone, but somehow no longer quite so broken as they'd been that morning. The real story was just beginning, preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The ride to Jake's cabin stretched 15 miles through terrain that looked like God had forgotten to finish it. Red rocks jutted from the earth like broken teeth, and the sparse vegetation clung to life with the desperate tenacity of desert survivors. Jake had borrowed a horse from the livery stable for the woman to ride, explaining to the suspicious owner that he had a new worker who needed transportation. The lie sat heavy in his stomach, but the truth would have been impossible to explain. She rode beside him in silence, her back straight despite the chains that still bound her wrists. The sheriff had refused to remove them without proper paperwork, claiming it was for everyone's safety. Jake had wanted to argue, to point out that a woman who could barely weigh more than a sack of grain hardly posed a threat to anyone. But he'd learned long ago that arguing with authority in frontier towns was a luxury he couldn't afford. The burlap sack that covered her head swayed slightly with the horse's movement, and Jake found himself stealing glances at her throughout the journey. Her hands, gripping the reins with practiced ease, told a story of someone who'd spent considerable time on horseback. Her posture spoke of dignity, maintained despite circumstances that would have broken lesser spirits. Most intriguingly, she seemed to know exactly where they were going, her head turning at landmarks that Jake himself used for navigation. "You know this country," he said after they'd been riding for an hour. It wasn't a question. "My people have traveled these paths for generations," she replied, her voice carrying across the desert air with startling clarity. "Every rock, every canyon, every water source has a story. This land remembers us, even if your people prefer to forget." Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks that had nothing to do with the Arizona sun. I don't think of it as my people and your people. I think of it as just people. That's a luxury of being on the winning side," she said, though. Her tone wasn't bitter, just matter of fact. "When you're Apache, you learn the difference between people who see you as human and people who see you as problem to be solved." The conversation died there, leaving them with only the sound of horses, hooves on hard-packed earth, and the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. Jake found himself wrestling with uncomfortable thoughts about his own assumptions and the society he'd been raised in. He'd never considered himself prejudiced, but he'd also never had to consider what it meant to be seen as less than human by the majority of the people around him. They stopped at a small spring that bubbled up from between two large boulders, creating a brief oasis of green in the otherwise brown landscape. Jake dismounted first, then moved to help the woman down from her horse. She accepted his assistance with the same careful neutrality she'd shown throughout the journey, neither welcoming nor rejecting his presence. "I need to water the horses," Jake said. leading both animals to the spring. "And I thought you might want to rest for a few minutes. We're about halfway there." She nodded, settling herself on a flat rock in the shade of a stunted oak tree. Jake watched her from the corner of his eye as he tended to the horses, noting the way she seemed to catalog everything around her: the direction of the wind, the position of the sun, the various paths leading away from the spring. He realized she was memorizing escape routes, and the knowledge made his chest tight with something that might have been guilt or might have been respect. "What's your name?" he asked suddenly, the question escaping before he could stop it. She turned her head toward him, and he caught a glimpse of her eyes through the holes in the sack. They were dark brown, almost black, with depths that seemed to hold secrets he couldn't begin to fathom. "My Apache name wouldn't mean anything to you," she said. "The soldiers who brought me in called me Sarah. It seemed to make them more comfortable." "Sarah," Jake repeated, testing the name on his tongue. It felt wrong somehow, too ordinary for someone who carried herself like royalty despite her circumstances. "Do you prefer that, or would you rather tell me your real name?" She was quiet for so long that Jake thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My name is Ayana. It means eternal blossom in my language. My grandmother gave it to me when I was born because she said I would bloom in places where others saw only desert." "Ayana," Jake said carefully, trying to match the pronunciation she'd used. "That's beautiful. It suits you better than Sarah." "You don't know if it suits me," she said, and there was something almost amused in her tone. "You've never seen my face." Jake felt his cheeks burn again, but this time it wasn't from embarrassment. It was from a sudden, overwhelming curiosity about the woman beneath the sack. Not just her appearance, though he'd be lying if he said he wasn't curious about that too, but everything about her. Her story, her thoughts, her dreams, her fears. He wanted to know what had happened to her, how she'd ended up at that auction, what she'd lost, and what she hoped to find. "I've seen your eyes," he said quietly, "and I've heard your voice. I've watched the way you carry yourself, the way you handle a horse, the way you see things that other people miss. That's enough to know that Sarah doesn't fit. You're Ayana." She tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that made him feel like she was seeing right through him. "Why does it matter to you, what I'm called, I mean? Tomorrow you'll put me to work in your kitchen or your fields, and I'll be whatever you need me to be. Names are luxuries for people who get to choose their own fate." The words hit Jake like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. He'd bought her, paid $5 for a human being, and now he was asking her to trust him, to share pieces of herself with him, as if they were equals. The hypocrisy of it made him sick. "I don't want you to be whatever I need you to be," he said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "I want you to be whoever you are. And if who I am doesn't fit into your world, if my people's ways offend your neighbors, if having an Apache woman on your property causes problems for you." Jake stood up from where he'd been kneeling beside, the spring water dripping from his hands. He turned to face her fully, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other across the small clearing. Even with the sack hiding her face, he could feel the weight of her gaze, the challenge in her posture. "Then we'll figure it out," he said, "together." The journey resumed in a different kind of silence, one that felt less hostile and more contemplative. Jake found himself pointing out landmarks as they rode, the twin peaks that marked the northern boundary of the territory, the canyon where flash floods carved new paths every spring, the grove of cottonwoods that provided the only real shade. For miles in any direction, Ayana listened without comment, but he could sense her attention, the way she absorbed every detail he shared. It occurred to him that she might be thinking about escape, memorizing the terrain for future reference. The thought should have worried him, but instead, it made him oddly proud. Even in chains, even after being sold like livestock, she was still thinking, still planning. Still fighting in her own quiet way, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when Jake's cabin finally came into view. It wasn't much to look at, a simple wooden structure with a single room, a small porch, and a lean-to stable that he'd built himself. But it was clean and well-maintained, with a vegetable garden that he'd coaxed into life through sheer stubbornness and careful management of precious water. "Home," he said, then immediately felt foolish for the word. It wasn't her home, might never be her home. It was just the place where she'd be expected to live while she worked off whatever debt he'd created by buying her. Ayanna said nothing, but he saw her take in every detail of the property, the chicken coop, the small corral, the woodpile, the rain barrel that caught precious moisture from the cabin's roof. Her assessment was thorough and professional, and Jake realized she was evaluating not just the physical space, but the man who'd created it. He helped her down from the horse, acutely aware of the trust she was placing in him by accepting his assistance. Her chains made dismounting awkward, and he found himself supporting more of her weight than he'd expected. She was smaller than she'd appeared on horseback, but there was a wiry strength in her frame that spoke of a life spent surviving in harsh conditions. "I'll need to get those chains off you," Jake said, gesturing toward her bound wrists. "I've got some tools in the cabin that should work. And if I run?" she asked, meeting his eyes through the holes in the sack. Jake considered the question. Seriously. The nearest town was 15 miles away, and the desert between here and there was unforgiving to anyone who didn't know its secrets. But Ayanna clearly did know those secrets, probably better than he did. If she wanted to disappear into the wilderness, she could probably manage it. "Then I guess you run," he said finally. "I won't try to stop you." She tilted her head, studying him with that same intense focus she'd shown at the spring. "Why not? You paid $5 for me. That's a lot of money for a cowboy." "Because $5 doesn't buy a person," Jake said, the words coming out harder than he'd intended. "It never did. I may have been stupid enough to participate in that auction, but I'm not stupid enough to think it made you my property. Then what am I?" she asked, and there was something vulnerable in her voice that made Jake's chest tight. "If I'm not your property and I'm not free to leave, then what? I'm one?" Jake looked at her standing there in his yard, still wearing the burlap sack that marked her as damaged goods, still bound by chains that declared her less than human. He thought about his own chains, the guilt and loneliness that had driven him to this desert, the grief that followed him like a shadow, the sense of being broken beyond repair. "I don't know," he admitted. "I guess we'll have to figure that out too." The sun was painting the western sky in shades of orange and purple when Jake finally managed to cut through the chains around Ayanna's wrists. He'd used a combination of bolt cutters and patient filing, working carefully to avoid injuring her while she sat perfectly still on his porch. The metal had left angry red marks on her skin, and he found himself wanting to apologize for every person who'd put her in those chains. "Better?" he asked, setting the tools aside. Ayanna rubbed her wrists, restoring circulation to her hands. "Better," she agreed. Then, unexpectedly, she reached up and began working at the ties that held the burlap sack in place. Jake's heart began to race. This was the moment he'd been both anticipating and dreading, the moment when he'd see what lay beneath the covering, when he'd learn whether the auctioneer's warnings about her condition were accurate. He found himself holding his breath, torn between curiosity and the fear that his reaction might hurt her. "You don't have to," he started to say, but she cut him off. "Yes, I do," she said simply. "If we're going to figure this out together, you need to know what you're dealing with." The sack fell away, and Jake Morrison got his first look at Ayanna's face. For a moment, he forgot to breathe. Then he understood why she'd said he would weep, though not for the reasons anyone might have expected. She was beautiful. The tears came without warning, rolling down Jake Morrison's weathered cheeks as he stared at the woman sitting before him. Ayana's face was indeed marked by fire, a network of scars that traced delicate patterns across the left side of her face and neck, pulling slightly at the corner of her mouth and creating a texture like marble veined with silver. But it wasn't the scars that made him weep. It was the breathtaking beauty that surrounded them, the way her dark eyes sparkled with intelligence and pain, the graceful curve of her cheekbones, the strength in her jaw that spoke of a spirit that refused to be broken. "I'm sorry," he whispered, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I'm so sorry." Ayana's expression didn't change, but he caught the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her hands moved protectively toward her scarred cheek. She'd clearly misinterpreted his reaction, thinking his tears were from revulsion rather than the overwhelming surge of emotion that came from seeing someone so beautiful treated as damaged goods. "I told you it was bad," she said quietly, her voice carefully neutral. "The soldiers who found me said I was lucky to be alive. The fire took more than just my appearance, it took my place in the world. No Apache man would have me now, and no white man would want me. I'm caught between worlds, belonging to neither." Jake shook his head, trying to find words that could possibly convey what he was feeling. "No, you don't understand. I'm not crying because of the scars. I'm crying because you're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen, and those people at the auction were blind, cruel fools who couldn't see past the surface to the treasure underneath." Ayana's eyes widened, and for the first time since he'd met her, she seemed genuinely surprised. "You're lying to make me feel better." "I've never been much good at lying," Jake said, moving slowly to sit on the porch step a few feet away from her. "And I've never been one to say things I don't mean. You are beautiful, Ayana. Not despite the scars, not in spite of them, but including them. They're part of your story, and your story is part of what makes you who you are." She studied his face intently, searching for signs of deception or pity. What she found instead was something that made her own eyes grow bright with unshed tears, genuine admiration, mixed with a tenderness that she hadn't encountered in longer than she could remember. "Tell me about the fire," Jake said gently. "If you want to, if it's not too painful." Ayana was quiet for a long moment, her fingers unconsciously tracing the scars on her cheek. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of memories that had been locked away for too long. "It happened 2 years ago. Our village was attacked by soldiers, not regular army, but a group of men who called themselves Indian fighters. They came at dawn, when most of the warriors were away hunting. They said we were harboring renegades, that we needed to be taught a lesson about cooperating with the territorial government." Jake felt his stomach clench. He'd heard stories about such attacks, unofficial raids that the government denied knowing about but rarely bothered to investigate. They were acts of terrorism disguised as justice, designed to drive Apache communities from their ancestral lands. "They burned everything," Ayana continued, her voice growing distant as she relived the memory. "The lodges, the food stores, the sacred items that had been passed down through generations. I was trying to save the medicine bundles from my grandmother's lodge when the roof collapsed. A burning beam caught me across the face and shoulder." She paused, touching the scars that extended down her neck toward her collarbone. "My brother pulled me from the flames, but the damage was done. Not just to my face, but to our family's standing in the community. In Apache culture, physical perfection is important for marriage prospects. A scarred woman brings shame to her family, limits their ability to form alliances through marriage." "That's barbaric," Jake said, his voice rough with anger. "To judge someone's worth based on scars they got trying to save sacred items. Is it more barbaric than your people's auction?" Ayana asked, but there was no accusation in her tone, just weary acceptance. "Every culture has its ways of deciding who belongs and who doesn't. I learned that I didn't belong anywhere anymore." Jake wanted to argue, to tell her that not all white people were like the ones at the auction, that not all communities were so quick to judge. But he knew the words would ring hollow. He'd seen enough cruelty in his 28 years to know that prejudice and fear were common human failings, not limited to any single group. "What happened to your family?" he asked instead. "Dead," she said simply. "My brother died in the attack. My parents died of grief 6 months later, at least. That's what the medicine man said. I think they died of shame, of having a daughter who reminded everyone of their failure to protect the village." The matter-of-fact way she delivered this information made Jake's heart ache. He could hear the pain beneath her calm exterior, the weight of loss and rejection that she'd been carrying alone for 2 years. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "That's too much loss for anyone to bear." "Loss is part of life," Ayanna replied, though her voice trembled slightly. "Apache children learn early that everything can be taken away in an instant. The trick is learning how to keep going when everything you loved is gone." Jake nodded, understanding her words in a way that most people wouldn't. "I know something about that," he said quietly. "My wife died in a fire too. Back in Kansas. Our whole farm burned down with her inside it." Ayanna's expression softened, and for the first time, she looked at him not as her purchaser or even as a potential threat, but as someone who might understand the particular kind of pain that comes from losing everything to flames. "Is that why you came to Arizona?" she asked. "To escape the memories?" "I thought I was," Jake admitted, "but the memories followed me. They always do. I've been running for 3 years, trying to outrun the guilt and the loneliness. But today, when I saw you standing there," he paused, struggling to find the right words. "I saw someone who'd survived something I'm not sure I could survive. Someone who'd lost everything, but was still fighting." "I'm not fighting," Ayanna said. "I'm just existing." "There's a difference." "No," Jake said firmly. "You're fighting. The way you carried yourself at that auction, the way you refused to let them break your spirit, the way you're talking to me now instead of just accepting whatever fate I had in mind, that's fighting. That's choosing to live instead of just survive." Ayanna looked away, but not before Jake caught a glimpse of something in her eyes that might have been hope. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun complete its descent toward the horizon. The desert evening was cooling down, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the vast Arizona sky. "I should show you where you'll be staying," Jake said eventually. "You must be exhausted." He led her into the cabin, lighting an oil lamp to chase away the gathering darkness. The single room was sparse but clean, with a stone fireplace, a small table, a couple of chairs, and a bed in the corner. Jake suddenly realized the obvious problem with his invitation. There was nowhere for her to sleep except his bed, and he couldn't very well expect her to sleep on the floor. "I'll make you a pallet by the fire," he said, already moving toward a chest where he kept extra blankets. "It'll be comfortable enough and warm. Where will you sleep?" Ayanna asked, looking around the small space. "Outside," Jake said. "It's a nice night, and I've slept under the stars plenty of times. Won't hurt me to do it again." Ayanna shook her head. "This is your home. I won't force you out of it." "You're not forcing me anywhere," Jake said gently. "I'm choosing to make sure you're comfortable and safe. There's a difference." She studied his face in the lamplight, and Jake could see her wrestling with the unfamiliar concept of someone putting her needs before their own. It occurred to him that she'd probably been treated as a burden or a problem for so long that basic kindness seemed suspicious. "I don't understand you," she said finally. "You paid money for me, brought me to your home, and now you're giving me your bed and sleeping outside. What do you want from me?" It was a fair question, and Jake realized he didn't have a clear answer. What did he want from her? He'd acted on instinct at the auction, driven by something he couldn't name. Now, sitting in his cabin with this remarkable woman, he was beginning to understand that his motivations were more complex than simple charity. "I want to know your story," he said slowly, working through his thoughts as he spoke. I want to understand how someone survives what you've survived. I want to learn from your strength, and she prompted, clearly sensing there was more. Jake took a deep breath, preparing to admit something he'd barely acknowledged to himself. And I want to stop being so alone. I want to remember what it feels like to have someone to talk to, someone to share meals with, someone who understands what it's like to lose everything and have to start over. Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, her scarred face thoughtful in the lamplight. You're asking me to be your friend, she said finally. Not your servant or your property, but your friend. I'm asking you to consider it, Jake said. I know. It's not simple. I know there are complications, legal ones, social ones, cultural ones. But maybe we can figure those out as we go. And if we can't, if the complications become too much? Jake looked at her, this woman who'd been through hell and emerged with her dignity intact, who'd been sold like livestock but refused to be broken, who'd trusted him enough to remove the sack that hid her beautiful scarred face. He thought about the loneliness that had been eating at him for 3 years, the emptiness that had driven him to make increasingly desperate choices. Then we'll face them together, he said. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. Ayanna nodded slowly, and Jake saw something in her expression that looked like the beginning of trust. It wasn't complete. It would take time to build that kind of faith after everything she'd been through, but it was a start. I'll need to earn my keep, she said. I won't be a burden on you. You'll never be a burden, Jake said firmly. But if it makes you feel better, there's plenty of work around here. I've been letting the garden go to weeds, and I'm a terrible cook. Plus, I could use help with the horses and the chickens. I can do those things, Ayanna said. And I know about desert plants, which ones are good for food, which ones have medicinal properties. I can help you make this place more sustainable. Jake smiled, feeling something like hope stirring in his chest for the first time in years. See, we're partners already. As he prepared the pallet by the fire and gathered blankets for his night under the stars, Jake Morrison realized that his life had just taken a turn he'd never expected. He'd bought a woman's freedom and somehow found his own. He'd looked past the surface to see true beauty, and in doing so, he'd discovered something beautiful in himself, the capacity to care for someone else again, to open his heart to the possibility of connection and maybe, eventually, love. Outside, the desert night was clear and cool, full of stars and infinite possibilities. Inside the cabin, Ayanna settled into her makeshift bed, perhaps feeling safe for the first time in 2 years. And on the porch, Jake Morrison lay on his bedroll, staring up at the vast Arizona sky and wondering what tomorrow would bring to two damaged souls who'd found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances. The healing was about to begin. The first week of their unexpected partnership unfolded with the careful precision of 2 wounded animals learning to share the same territory. Jake would wake before dawn to tend his horses and check the fence lines, while Ayanna quietly transformed his neglected garden into something that resembled actual cultivation. They moved around each other with polite caution, each respecting the other's space while gradually establishing the rhythms of shared domesticity. Jake had never realized how much noise loneliness made until it was replaced by the subtle sounds of another person's presence. The soft padding of bare feet on wooden floors, the gentle humming of Apache songs while working, the whisper of traditional prayers spoken at sunrise and sunset. Ayanna brought a kind of peaceful energy to his rough bachelor existence that he hadn't known he'd been missing. On the 4th morning, Jake emerged from his bedroll on the porch to find Ayanna kneeling beside a small fire she'd built in the yard, grinding something in a stone bowl that definitely hadn't been among his possessions the night before. The sight of her silhouetted against the dawn sky, her scarred face peaceful in concentration, stirred something in his chest that he didn't quite know how to name. "Morning," he said quietly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up with a small smile that made his heart skip. "Good morning." I hope you don't mind. I gathered some mezcal root yesterday while you were working. I thought I'd make us proper breakfast instead of just hardtack and coffee. Jake's usual breakfast consisted of whatever was easiest to prepare and consume quickly. The idea of someone taking the time to make a real meal, especially for his benefit, was almost overwhelming in its simple kindness. I don't mind at all, he said, settling down beside her fire. What can I do to help? Ayanna handed him a handful of small dried berries. These are peanut nuts. They need to be cracked and cleaned. My grandmother always said that sharing the work makes the food taste better. They worked in comfortable silence as the sun climbed higher, Jake awkwardly fumbling with the tiny nuts, while Ayanna efficiently prepared what turned out to be a kind of porridge made from the ground mezcal root, mixed with the nuts and some wild honey she'd somehow procured. The result was unlike anything Jake had ever tasted, nutty and sweet, with a richness that seemed to provide energy that would last all day. This is incredible, Jake said, trying not to devour his portion too quickly. Where did you learn to cook like this? My grandmother, Ayanna said, her expression growing soft with memory. She said that knowing how to find food in the desert was the difference between surviving and thriving. Every plant has a purpose, every season has its gifts. You just have to know how to look. Could you teach me? Jake asked. I've been living here for 6 months, and I've barely learned to tell the difference between edible and poisonous. Ayanna's face lit up with something that might have been pleasure. You want to learn Apache ways? I want to learn your ways, Jake corrected. I want to understand how you see this place, how you make it work for you instead of against you. That afternoon, Jake found himself following Ayanna through the desert landscape with the wonder of a child discovering a hidden world. She showed him how to identify barrel cactus that could provide water in emergencies, how to find the subtle signs that indicated underground springs, how to read the behavior of birds and animals to understand weather patterns and seasonal changes. This is ghost plant, she said, kneeling beside a silvery-leafed succulent that Jake had walked past 1,000 times without noticing. The leaves make a tea that helps with coughs and chest pain. And see this? She pointed to a low-growing shrub with tiny yellow flowers. Brittlebush. The resin can be chewed for headaches, and the leaves make a wash that helps with wounds. You're like a walking pharmacy, Jake said, genuinely amazed. How do you remember all of this? The same way you remember how to read the weather or judge a horse's temperament, Ayanna replied. It's knowledge that gets passed down because it keeps you alive. My grandmother started teaching me when I was barely old enough to walk. Jake watched her gather samples of various plants, explaining their uses with the patience of a natural teacher. It struck him that in his society, this kind of knowledge would be dismissed as primitive superstition. But here in the desert, it was the difference between life and death. Ayanna possessed a doctorate in survival that no university could provide. What about this one? Jake asked, pointing to a plant with broad, fleshy leaves and a tall stalk of red flowers. Ah, Ayanna said, her eyes sparkling with something that might have been mischief. Desert willow. Very useful plant. The bark makes a tea that helps with fever and pain. But the flowers. She paused, seeming to consider something. The flowers are used in love magic. Jake felt his cheeks warm. Love magic? Apache women would gather the flowers at dawn and weave them into their hair when they wanted to attract a specific man's attention. My grandmother said it worked because the flowers made a woman feel beautiful and confident, and that confidence was more attractive than any magic. There was something in the way she said it, the way her eyes met his for just a moment before looking away, that made Jake's pulse quicken. Was she telling him about love magic for purely educational purposes, or was there something else in her words? Did you ever ... He started to ask, then stopped, realizing the question was too personal. Use love magic? Ayanna finished, saving him from his awkwardness. Once, when I was 16, there's a young warrior who'd caught my attention. I wove desert willow flowers into my hair and wore my finest dress to the harvest dance. What happened? Ayana's expression grew distant. He danced with me once, very politely. Then he spent the rest of the evening with a girl whose face hadn't been touched by fire. I learned that night that there's no magic strong enough to overcome some obstacles. Jake felt a surge of anger toward the long-dead warrior who'd been too blind to see Ayana's worth. He was a fool. He was practical, Ayana said matter-of-factly. Marriage is about alliances and children and building a stable life. Beauty fades, but scars remain. He chose someone who would bring honor to his family, not questions about his judgment. Beauty doesn't fade, Jake said firmly. It changes, deepens, becomes more meaningful. Any man who can't see that isn't worth your time. Ayana looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. You say that now, but you've only known me for 4 days. What happens when the novelty wears off? When you realize that having an Apache woman on your property makes your life more complicated? It was a fair question, and Jake knew she was. Asking it based on experience, probably. Painful experience with other white people, who'd seemed accepting at first but had changed their minds when social pressure mounted. I don't know, he admitted. I can't promise that things won't get complicated. But I can promise that if they do, we'll face them together. I won't abandon you when things get difficult. People make promises they can't keep, Ayana said quietly. Especially when those promises involve choosing between what's easy and what's right. Jake wanted to argue, to insist that he was different, that his word meant something. But he knew that words were cheap and that Ayana had probably heard similar promises before. Instead, he did the only thing he could do. He continued to show up, day after day, proving through his actions that he was someone she could trust. That trust began to build in small increments. Jake started sleeping inside the cabin again. But he rigged a curtain across the middle of the room to give them both privacy. Ayana began sharing stories about her childhood, her people's traditions, the complex social structures that had governed her life before the fire changed everything. In return, Jake told her about his farm in Kansas, his wife Margaret, the dreams he'd had before tragedy reshaped his understanding of what was possible. What was she like? Ayana asked one evening as they sat on the porch, sharing a simple dinner of rabbit stew and cornbread. Margaret? Jake smiled at the memory. She was small but fierce. Couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds, but she could face down a charging bull without flinching. She had these green eyes that could look right through you, and she never let me get away with feeling sorry for myself. You loved her very much. I did, Jake said simply. I thought I'd never love anyone that much again. Didn't think I was capable of it anymore. There was something in the way he said thought that made Ayana look at him sharply. And now? Jake met her eyes, seeing in them the same vulnerability he felt in his own heart. Now I'm beginning to think that maybe the heart has more capacity for love than I gave it credit for. Maybe losing someone doesn't mean you can never care for someone else. Maybe it just means you understand how precious caring is. Ayana was quiet for a long moment, her scarred fingers tracing patterns on the wooden porch rail. In Apache culture, we believe that the spirits of the dead want the living to find happiness, that they become restless if we mourn them too long, too deeply. We honor them by choosing to live fully, not by dying a little bit every day. Is that what you're doing? Jake asked gently. Living fully? I'm trying to remember how, Ayana replied. For 2 years I've been existing, getting through each day, but not really living. Being here with you, learning to trust again. It's like waking up from a long dark dream. Jake reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. When she didn't, he covered her scarred hand with his own, feeling the warmth of her skin, the slight tremor that ran through her fingers at his touch. We're both waking up, he said quietly. Both learning to live again. The physical contact lasted only a moment, before Ayanna gently pulled her hand away. But something had changed between them. The careful politeness was giving way to something deeper, more real. They were no longer just two damaged people sharing space. They were becoming partners in the truest sense, two souls helping each other heal. That night, Jake lay on his side of the curtained cabin, listening to the soft sounds of Ayanna's breathing on the other side. For the first time in 3 years, he didn't dream about the fire that had taken his wife. Instead, he dreamed about desert flowers blooming in impossible places, about strength that grew from brokenness, about a scarred woman whose beauty had the power to heal hearts he'd thought were beyond repair. In the morning, they would face whatever challenges came their way. But for now, in the quiet darkness of a cabin in the middle of nowhere, two people who'd thought they were beyond saving were discovering that sometimes salvation comes in the most unexpected forms, wearing the most unexpected faces and asking for nothing more than the chance to prove that love can bloom in the harshest of soils. 3 weeks into their peaceful existence, the outside world came knocking on Jake Morrison's door in the form of his boss, Charles Whitmore, and two men Jake didn't recognize. The sound of approaching horses shattered the morning calm like gunshots, sending the chickens scattering and bringing both Jake and Ayanna to immediate alertness. Jake had been repairing a section of fence while Ayanna tended to the garden, their comfortable routine disrupted by the thunder of hoofbeats and the jingling of spurs. Through the cabin window, Ayanna caught sight of the riders and immediately moved away from the glass, her survival instincts kicking in with practiced efficiency. "Morrison." Whitmore's voice boomed across the yard, carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Get out here. We need to talk." Jake set down his tools and walked slowly toward the mounted men, his mind racing through possible explanations for this unexpected visit. Whitmore was a large man with a perpetually red face and the kind of aggressive posture that came from years of bullying people weaker than himself. The two strangers flanking him wore the distinctive badges of territorial marshals, their hands resting casually on their gun belts. "Mr. Whitmore," Jake said, keeping his voice carefully neutral. "Didn't expect to see you out here. Something wrong at the ranch?" "You tell me," Whitmore replied, his pale eyes scanning the cabin and outbuildings with obvious suspicion. "I've been hearing some interesting stories about you in town. Stories about you buying yourself an Apache woman at auction." Jake's blood ran cold, but he kept his expression steady. "I don't know what you're talking about, don't you?" One of the marshals spoke up, pulling a folded paper from his coat pocket. "Marshal Tom Bradley here, Territorial Authority. We've got reports of an illegal purchase of Native American labor. Seen someone matching your description paid $5 for an Apache female 3 weeks ago." "Even if that were true," Jake said carefully, "buying at a legal auction isn't a crime." "Depends on what you're doing with your purchase," the second marshal said, his voice carrying an unpleasant insinuation. "Territorial law requires registration of all Native American workers. You got papers on her?" Jake felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the morning chill. He'd been so focused on helping Ayanna heal and building their partnership that he'd completely ignored the legal complexities of her situation. In the eyes of the law, she was still classified as indentured labor, which meant her presence on his property without proper documentation was illegal. "She's not here," Jake lied, praying that Ayanna had the sense to stay hidden inside the cabin. Whitmore's laugh was harsh and ugly. "Boy, you always were a terrible liar. We know she's here. Question is, what exactly are you doing with her?" The implication in his tone made Jake's hands clench into fists. "I'm not doing anything with anyone. I live alone, that's so?" Marshal Bradley dismounted with deliberate slowness, his hand never leaving his gun. "Then you won't mind if we take a look around. Make sure you're not harboring any fugitives or unregistered workers." Jake stepped between the marshal and the cabin, his heart pounding. "You need a warrant to search my property." "Actually," the second marshal said, producing another document. "We've got one right here. Signed by Judge Patterson in Tucson. Gives us full authority to search for and apprehend any illegal Apache workers in the territory." The situation was spiraling out of control, and Jake could feel panic rising in his chest. If they found Ayanna, they'd take her back to whatever hell she'd escaped from. Worse, they might arrest him for harboring her illegally, leaving her completely defenseless. "Look," Jake said, trying to keep his voice reasonable, "I understand you're just doing your job. But there's nothing here that concerns territorial law. I'm a simple ranch hand, nothing more. Simple ranch hand who can afford to spend $5 on Apache women," Whitmore sneered. "I pay you $12 a month, Morrison. That's nearly half your wages on one purchase. Makes a man wonder what you're really getting for your money." The crude suggestion made Jake's vision blur with rage. Without thinking, he took a step toward Whitmore, his fists raised. The two marshals immediately drew their weapons, the metallic clicking of cocking hammers loud in the morning air. "Easy there, cowboy," Marshal Bradley said, his voice deadly calm. "No need for anyone to get hurt. We're just going to take a look around, find what we're looking for, and be on our way." That's when the cabin door opened and Ayanna stepped out onto the porch. Jake's heart stopped. She was wearing one of the simple dresses he'd bought for her in town, her long black hair braided neatly down her back. Most importantly, she wasn't wearing anything to cover her scars. Her face was clearly visible, the network of burn marks, catching the morning light like delicate silver tracery. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice calm and dignified, "I believe you're looking for me." The three men stared at her with a mixture of curiosity and revulsion. Jake could practically hear their mental calculations: beautiful woman, damaged goods, probably worth the trouble of retrieving. "Well, well," Whitmore said, his voice oily with false pleasantry. "The famous Apache bride. Have to say, Morrison, I can see why you'd pay $5 for something like that. Even with the scarring, she's got possibilities." Jake took another step forward, his control hanging by a thread. "Watch your mouth, Whitmore." "Or what?" Whitmore laughed. "You'll defend your property? Face it, boy, you're in over your head. You bought yourself a woman without understanding the legal implications, and now you're going to pay the price." Marshal Bradley holstered his weapon and approached Ayanna with the casual confidence of someone who'd done this many times before. "Ma'am, I need to see your papers. Registration documents, work permits, anything that shows you're legally authorized to be here." "I don't have any papers," Ayanna said simply. "I was sold at auction 3 weeks ago. Mr. Morrison purchased me for $5. "And since then, you've been working for him, earning wages?" Ayanna's eyes flicked to Jake, and he could see her weighing her options. She could tell the truth, that they'd been partners, that she'd been free to leave at any time, but that would implicate Jake in harboring an illegal worker. Or she could lie, play the role of indentured servant, and hope to protect him from legal consequences. "I've been working," she said carefully. "Cooking, cleaning, tending the garden. Standard domestic duties." "Hung," Marshal Bradley said, his tone skeptical. "And where exactly have you been sleeping?" "This is a one-room cabin." Jake felt the world tilting around him. The marshal's question was designed to trap them in either an admission of impropriety or a lie that could be easily disproven. Either way, the implications would be devastating for both of them. "I sleep by the fire," Ayanna said, her voice steady despite the obvious trap. "Mr. Morrison has been very proper in his treatment of me." "I'm sure he has," the marshal said with a smirk. "Nothing improper about a man and a woman living alone together in a single room for 3 weeks." "That's enough," Jake said, his voice dangerous. "She's answered your questions. What else do you want?" "What we want," Whitmore said, dismounting from his horse, is to collect what's owed to the territorial government. See, the auction where you bought her? It was illegal. The auctioneer had no authority to sell Apache prisoners. That makes your purchase void. Jake's world crumbled. What are you saying? I'm saying she's government property now. We're taking her back to the territorial prison in Tucson, where she'd be properly processed and assigned to authorized work detail. No. The word came out of Jake's mouth with absolute finality. You're not taking her anywhere. Boy, you're not in a position to negotiate, Marshal Bradley said, his hand moving back to his gun. This woman is coming with us, and you're going to let her go quietly, or we're going to have a problem. Jake looked at Ayanna, seeing the resignation in her eyes. She'd known this moment would come, had probably been preparing for it every day. Since she'd removed the burlap sack, the brief taste of freedom, of partnership, of something approaching happiness, it had all been borrowed time. Jake, she said quietly, don't do anything foolish. They have the law on their side. The law is wrong, Jake said, his voice rough with emotion. You're not property. You're not a prisoner. You're a human being with rights and dignity and worth. Apache woman doesn't have rights, Whitmore said with cruel satisfaction. She's got whatever privileges the territorial government decides to grant her. And right now, those privileges don't include living in sin with a white cowboy. The accusation hit Jake like a physical blow. Living in sin, that's how they would characterize the partnership he and Ayanna had built. The careful respect they'd shown each other. The gradual healing they'd both experienced. In the eyes of the law, their relationship was nothing more than an illegal arrangement that threatened social order. Give me a minute to gather my things, Ayanna said, her voice carefully controlled. I won't cause any trouble. Ayanna, no, Jake said, desperation creeping into his voice. There has to be another way. We can fight this legally. We can't fight the entire territorial government, she said, and the sadness in her voice nearly broke his heart. I knew this was temporary. I'm grateful for the time we had. As she turned to go back into the cabin, Jake felt something snap inside him. He'd lost his wife to forces beyond his control, had spent 3 years running from the pain of that loss. Now he was about to lose the woman who'd taught him to live again. And this time it wasn't fate or accident, it was human cruelty, human law, human indifference to suffering. Wait, he said, his voice stronger than it had been in years. Wait. The 3 men turned to look at him, and Jake Morrison made a decision that would change everything. He walked to Ayanna's side, took her scarred hand in his, and faced the marshals with the kind of determination that comes from having nothing left to lose. If you're taking her, he said quietly, you're taking me too, because I'm not letting her go back to that hell alone. The silence that followed was deafening. Whitmore's face turned purple with rage. The marshals exchanged glances that suggested they hadn't expected this complication, and Ayanna stared at Jake with an expression of wonder and terror. You can't be serious, Marshal Bradley said finally. You're willing to throw away your life for an Apache woman. Jake looked at Ayanna, at the strength in her scarred face, at the courage that had carried her through losses that would have destroyed lesser people. He thought about the peaceful mornings they'd shared, the conversations that had healed parts of his soul he'd thought were beyond repair, the way she'd looked at him like he was worth something more than his grief. I'm willing to fight for someone who matters to me, he said simply. Someone who's worth fighting for. The confrontation was far from over, but Jake Morrison had drawn his line in the sand. Whatever came next, he wouldn't face it alone, and neither would she. For the first time in 3 years, he had something worth fighting for, and he intended to fight with everything he had. The tension in Jake Morrison's yard could have been cut with a knife as 4 men stared at each other across a divide that seemed to represent everything wrong with the Arizona territory. Jake's declaration that he would go with Ayanna had clearly caught the marshals off guard. and they were now calculating whether this complication was worth the trouble. "You're talking nonsense, Morrison," Marshal Bradley said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone men used when they thought they were dealing with someone who'd lost his mind. "Walk away from this. Go back to your job, find yourself a proper white woman, and forget about this Apache business." "I'm not walking away from anything," Jake said, his arm moving protectively around Ayanna's shoulders. "You want to take her? You'll have to go through me first." Whitmore spat in the dirt, his face twisted with disgust. "I always knew you were soft, Morrison, but I never took you for a complete fool. You're willing to destroy your life for a scarred-up Indian woman who probably can't even give you children." The cruel words hit Ayanna like physical blows, and Jake felt her stiffen beside him. He'd seen the pain that comment caused, the way it struck at insecurities that ran deeper than her visible scars. Without thinking, he turned to face her, his hands gently cupping her face. "Don't listen to him," he said quietly, his voice meant for her alone. "He doesn't know what he's talking about. He doesn't know you." "But he's right," Ayanna whispered, her voice barely audible. "I am damaged. I can't give you the life you deserve, the family you should have." "You are perfect exactly as you are," Jake said firmly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "And any man who can't see that is blind." The intimate moment was shattered by Marshal Bradley's harsh laugh. "Very touching, but it doesn't change the legal facts. This woman is government property, and you're interfering with official territorial business." "Then arrest me," Jake said, turning back to face the marshals. "If standing by someone I care about is a crime, then I'm guilty." The second marshal, who'd been silent until now, finally spoke up. "You know what, Bradley? Maybe we should take him up on that offer. Arrest them both. Let the judge sort it out." "You can't arrest him for caring about someone," Ayanna said, her voice growing stronger. "He's done nothing wrong." "He's harbored an illegal worker," Marshal Bradley replied. "That's a federal offense. Could get him 5 years in territorial prison." Jake felt Ayanna's hand tighten on his arm, and he knew she was thinking about backing down to protect him. But he'd made his choice, and he wasn't going to let fear change his mind now. "Do what you have to do," he said. "But I'm not abandoning her." That's when the sound of approaching horses interrupted the confrontation. Jake looked up to see a small group of riders cresting the hill that led to his property. As they drew closer, he recognized the lead rider as Dr. Samuel Hayes, the territorial doctor who'd treated him for a broken arm the previous winter. Behind him rode Father Miguel Santos, the Catholic priest who served the scattered communities throughout the region, and 3 other men Jake didn't recognize. "Dr. Hayes," Marshal Bradley called out, clearly surprised by the unexpected arrival. "What brings you out here?" The doctor, a tall man with graying hair and kind eyes, dismounted with the careful movements of someone who spent more time with medical books than horses. "I heard there might be trouble out here. Came to see if I could help." "No trouble," Whitmore said quickly. "Just collecting some government property." "Property?" Father Santos spoke up, his accented English carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades fighting injustice. "I see only people here, human beings created in God's image." "Don't start with your religious nonsense, Padre," Marshal Bradley said dismissively. "This is a legal matter." "Everything is a moral matter first," Father Santos replied calmly. "And I'm curious about the legality of your actions. Dr. Hayes, would you be so kind as to share what you discovered in your research?" Dr. Hayes reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a thick folder of documents. "I took the liberty of investigating the auction where this young woman was allegedly purchased. Quite interesting what I found." Jake felt a flutter of hope in his chest. "What did you find?" "That the territorial government had no authority to conduct such an auction," Dr. Hayes said, his voice carrying the precision of someone who'd done his homework. "The Apache prisoners were being held illegally, without proper paperwork or judicial review. The entire proceeding was a sham." Marshal Bradley's face darkened. That's impossible. We have authorization. You have forged documents, one of the other men interrupted, stepping forward. Jake now recognized him as Thomas Richardson, a territorial attorney who'd built his reputation fighting government corruption. I've spent the last 2 weeks investigating this case, and I can prove that the auction was conducted without proper authority. That's not possible, the second marshal said, but his voice lacked conviction. I'm afraid it is, Richardson continued, pulling out his own set of documents. The man who organized the auction, one Marcus Bentley, was operating without a territorial license. He's been arrested for fraud and theft of government property. The news hit the group like a thunderbolt. Jake felt Ayanna's hand tighten in his as they both began to understand what this might mean. Furthermore, Richardson continued, the Apache prisoners were never legally processed. They were captured in a raid that violated federal treaty obligations and held without due process. Every aspect of their detention was illegal. So what are you saying? Jake asked, hardly daring to hope. I'm saying that this young woman was never legally anyone's property, Richardson said. The auction was invalid, your purchase was meaningless. And she's been a free person all along. The silence that followed was deafening. Jake felt the world spinning around him as he tried to process what he'd just heard. Ayanna had been free all along? The past 3 weeks of careful partnership, of building trust and respect, had been based on a false premise? That's impossible, Whitmore sputtered. She's Apache. She's a prisoner of war. She's a civilian who was illegally detained, Father Santos said firmly. And now she's going to be treated as what she's always been, a human being with rights and dignity. Marshal Bradley looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. But your orders were based on fraudulent information, Dr. Hayes said. I've already notified the territorial governor. He's launched a full investigation into this entire affair. Jake turned to look at Ayanna, seeing the same stunned disbelief in her eyes that he felt in his own heart. You're free, he said quietly. You've been free this whole time. I don't understand, she whispered. If I was free, why didn't anyone tell me? Why was I treated like property? Because, Father Santos said gently, there are people in this territory who benefit from treating Apache citizens as less than human. They created a system of false imprisonment to provide cheap labor for their supporters. People like Whitmore. Richardson added, giving Jake's boss a pointed look. Who's been using illegally detained Apache workers on his ranch for the past 2 years? Whitmore's face went from red to purple. You can't prove anything. Actually, I can, Richardson said calmly. I have testimony from a dozen witnesses, including some of your own cowboys who grew uncomfortable with what they were seeing. The whole conspiracy was unraveling before their eyes. Jake felt a surge of anger at the injustice of it all, at the way Ayanna had been made to suffer for other people's greed and prejudice. What happens now? He asked. Now, Dr. Hayes said, this young woman is free to go wherever she chooses. Do whatever she wants. Live however she sees fit. The territorial government will provide compensation for her illegal detention, and those responsible will face criminal charges. Jake looked at Ayanna, seeing the overwhelming mix of emotions playing across her scarred face. Freedom, after 2 years of believing she was lost and worthless. Justice, after accepting that there was no justice for people like her. Hope, after learning to live without it. Where will you go? He asked quietly, suddenly terrified that her freedom might mean losing her forever. Ayanna looked at him with tears streaming down her face. I don't know, she admitted. I've been running for so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to have choices. You could stay here, Jake said, his heart pounding. If you want to. Not as my employee or my property, but as my partner. As someone I care about more than I've cared about anything in years. And if I said yes, she asked, what would that mean? How would we live? What would people say? I don't care what people say, Jake said firmly. I care about you. I care about the life we've started building together. I care about the way you've helped me remember what it means to be happy." Father Santos stepped forward with a gentle smile. "If I may suggest, there's a way to make this arrangement official. A way that would give you both the legal protections you deserve." Jake felt his heart stop. "What do you mean?" "I mean that if two people love each other, if they want to build a life together, the church recognizes no barriers of race or background. Love is love, regardless of the color of one's skin or the circumstances of one's birth." The implication was clear, and Jake felt his knees go weak. "Marriage," the priest was talking about marriage. "Ayanna," he said, turning to face her fully, "I know this is sudden. I know we've only known each other for 3 weeks. But in that time, you've become the most important person in my world. You've shown me what it means to be brave, to be kind, to be strong in the face of impossible odds." He dropped to one knee right there in the dirt, in front of the marshals and the priest and everyone else. "I don't have a ring. I don't have much of anything except a small cabin and a heart that's learned to love again because of you. But if you'll have me, I'll spend the rest of my life proving that you made the right choice." Ayanna stared down at him, her scarred face radiant with tears and hope and something that looked like joy. "Jake Morrison," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm asking you to be my wife," he said simply. "My partner, my equal, my best friend, and the love of my life, if you'll have me." The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then Ayanna smiled, not the careful, guarded smile she'd given him before, but a radiant expression of pure happiness that transformed her entire face. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying across the desert air like a song. "Yes, Jake Morrison, I'll marry you." The cheer that went up from Dr. Hayes, Father Santos, and Attorney Richardson was so loud it probably scared every animal within a mile radius. Even the marshals looked stunned by the sudden turn of events. Only Whitmore remained hostile, his face twisted with rage. "This is insane. You can't marry an Apache woman. It's not legal." "Actually," Richardson said with obvious satisfaction, "territorial law recognizes marriages between citizens, regardless of race. And as we've established, this young woman is a free citizen who was illegally detained. Furthermore," Father Santos added, "God's law recognizes love between all his children. I would be honored to perform the ceremony." Jake stood up and took Ayanna's hands in his, feeling like his heart might burst from happiness. "When?" he asked. "How?" "About now," Father Santos suggested. "Unless you have some pressing need to wait." Jake looked at Ayanna, seeing the same eagerness in her eyes that he felt in his own heart. They'd both been alone for too long, had both suffered too much to want to delay their happiness any longer. "Now sounds perfect," Ayanna said, and Jake Morrison knew that his life was about to change in the most wonderful way possible. The broken cowboy and the scarred Apache woman were about to become husband and wife, proving that love could triumph over law, prejudice, and the cruelest circumstances. Their story was far from over, but this chapter was ending with the most beautiful words either of them had ever heard, "I do." The impromptu wedding ceremony that took place in Jake Morrison's yard that afternoon became the stuff of legend in the Arizona Territory. Word spread quickly through the scattered communities, carried by riders who'd witnessed something unprecedented, a white cowboy and an Apache woman declaring their love in defiance of every social convention. Backed by the law and blessed by the church, Father Santos had insisted on conducting the ceremony properly, despite the unusual circumstances. While Dr. Hayes and Attorney Richardson kept watch for any additional trouble, the priest had Jake and Ayanna gather desert flowers for the bride's bouquet and asked the assembled men to serve as witnesses to what he called a union blessed by God and justified by love. "Before we begin," Father Santos said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd performed hundreds of ceremonies, I want to address the elephant in the room. Some people will say this marriage is wrong, that it violates the natural order of things. But I've seen the way you two look at each other, the way you've cared for each other despite impossible circumstances. That's not wrong. That's sacred. Jake stood facing Ayanna in the fading afternoon light, still hardly believing this was happening. She'd braided desert willow, flowers into her hair, the same flowers she'd told him about for love magic, and the effect was breathtaking. Her scarred face glowed with happiness, and Jake realized he'd never seen anyone more beautiful. Jake Morrison, Father Santos began, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part? Jake's voice was strong and clear. I do. And do you promise to honor and cherish her, to protect her from those who would do her harm, to see her as your equal partner in all things? I do, Jake said, his eyes never leaving Ayanna's face. Father Santos turned to Ayanna. Ayanna, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part? I do, Ayanna said, her voice trembling with emotion. And do you promise to honor and cherish him, to stand by him through whatever trials may come, to be his partner in building a life together? I do, she replied, tears streaming down her face. Then by the power vested in me by the Catholic Church and the territory of Arizona, I pronounce you husband and wife. Jake, you may kiss your bride. The kiss that followed was gentle, reverent, and witnessed by a group of men who'd just seen justice triumph over prejudice. When they separated, both Jake and Ayanna were crying, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, Father Santos announced with a broad smile, I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Jake Morrison. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Jake had ever experienced. Dr. Hayes produced a bottle of wine from his saddlebags, claiming he'd brought it in case of emergency, and this certainly qualified. Attorney Richardson had somehow procured a small cake from the bakery in town, having anticipated that the resolution of the legal case might call for celebration. Even the two marshals, clearly embarrassed by their role in the illegal detention, Scheme offered awkward congratulations before riding away to report the day's events to their superiors. Whitmore left without a word, his face black with rage. But Jake no longer cared about his former boss's opinion. As the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Jake and Ayanna found themselves alone. For the first time as husband and wife. The witnesses had departed with promises to spread the good news, leaving the newlyweds to begin their married life in the cabin where they'd first learned to trust each other. I can't believe we're married, Ayanna said, her voice filled with wonder as she touched the simple gold band that Dr. Hayes had somehow produced for the ceremony. I can't believe you said yes, Jake replied, pulling her into his arms. When I woke up this morning, I thought I might lose you forever. Now you're my wife. Your wife, Ayanna repeated, as if testing the words. I never thought I'd have that title. Never thought any man would want to claim me publicly, to stand up for me the way you did today. Jake cupped her scarred face in his hands, his thumbs gently tracing the silvery lines that marked her skin. Any man who wouldn't fight for you is a fool. You're the strongest, most beautiful, most courageous woman I've ever known. I'm not beautiful, Ayanna said, old insecurities surfacing despite the day's events. I'm damaged, scarred. You're perfect, Jake interrupted firmly. Every scar tells a story of survival, of strength, of refusing to give up when the world tried to break you. They're part of what makes you who you are, and I love who you are. Their first night as husband and wife was spent talking until dawn, sharing dreams and fears and hopes for the future. They spoke of the children they might have, the life they would build together, the challenges they would face as an interracial couple in a world that wasn't ready for their love. People will talk, Ayanna said as they watched the sunrise paint the desert in shades of gold and pink. They'll say terrible things about us, about our children if we have any. Let them talk, Jake said, his arm tightening around her. We'll raise our children to be proud of who they are, to understand that love is stronger than hate, that courage is more powerful than prejudice. And if they face the same challenges I faced, if they're rejected by both cultures, accepted by neither. Jake considered this seriously. It was a real concern, one that many mixed-race families faced in the territory. Then we'll teach them to create their own culture, their own community. We'll show them that belonging isn't about what other people think, it's about knowing your own worth and finding people who see it too. The practical aspects of their new life began to assert themselves over the following weeks. Jake's job with Whitmore was obviously over, but Attorney Richardson had offered him work as an investigator, helping to expose other cases of illegal detention and labor exploitation. The pay was better, and the work felt meaningful in a way that tending cattle never had. Ayanna threw herself into transforming their humble cabin into a real home. She expanded the garden, created proper storage for her growing collection of medicinal plants, and began teaching Jake more advanced survival skills. Her knowledge of desert ecology proved invaluable, and soon other settlers were coming to her for advice on everything from crop rotation to treating illnesses. You're becoming the unofficial doctor for half the territory, Jake observed one evening as he watched her prepare a poultice for a neighbor's infected wound. My grandmother always said that healing was a calling, not a job, Ayanna replied, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. If I can help people, I should help them. It doesn't matter if they're white or Apache or anything else. The transformation in both of them was remarkable. Jake had evolved from a broken man running from his past into someone who faced challenges head-on, who fought for what was right, who built rather than destroyed. Ayanna had blossomed from a woman who believed herself worthless into someone who knew her own value, who contributed to her community, who faced the world with confidence rather than fear. Their love story became a beacon of hope for other couples facing similar challenges. Mixed-race marriages were still rare and often controversial, but Jake and Ayanna's obvious happiness and mutual respect began to change minds in their community. They proved that love could transcend racial boundaries, that respect and partnership could overcome social prejudice. Dr. Hayes became a regular visitor, fascinated by Ayanna's medical knowledge and eager to learn traditional healing methods. Father Santos stopped by monthly, pleased to see the couple's continued happiness and quick to defend them against any criticism from his parishioners. You've become symbols, he told them one evening over dinner. Whether you wanted to or not, you represent hope to people who thought change was impossible. That's a lot of responsibility, Jake said, though he didn't seem burdened by it. All love carries responsibility, Father Santos replied. But your love carries the additional weight of proving that human dignity transcends artificial barriers. That's a sacred burden. The first real test of their marriage came 6 months later when Ayanna's cousin, a young Apache man named Joseph, arrived at their door. He'd been searching for surviving members of his family since the village attack, and news of Ayanna's marriage had reached him through the Apache communication network. I heard you married a white man, he said without preamble, his eyes taking in the comfortable cabin and well-tended garden. I came to see if it was true. It's true, Ayanna said, her voice calm but wary. She could sense the disapproval in his tone, the judgment that she'd feared from her own people. How could you? Joseph asked, his voice filled with pain. After what they did to our village, to our family, how could you marry one of them? Jake stepped forward, ready to defend his wife, but Ayanna placed a gentle hand on his arm. This was something she needed to handle herself. Because he's not one of them, she said firmly. He's Jake. He's the man who saw me as a human being when others saw me as damaged goods. He's the man who stood up to armed marshals to protect me. He's the man who chose love over convenience, who fights for justice even when it costs him. But he's white, Joseph said, as if that explained everything. So were the people who helped us expose the illegal detention scheme, Ayanna replied. So is the priest who married us, the doctor who treats our neighbors regardless of their race, the lawyer who fought for our rights. Evil isn't about skin color, Joseph. It's about choices. And Jake chooses to do what's right, even when it's hard. The conversation continued for hours, with Joseph gradually coming to understand that his cousin had found something precious, a partner who truly saw her as an equal, a love that transcended the boundaries that had seemed so important before. By the time he left the next morning, Joseph had given his blessing to their marriage, even offering to help them navigate the complex dynamics of being accepted by both the Apache and white communities. "You're building something new," he told them as he prepared to leave. "Something that could show both our peoples a different way forward." As Jake and Ayanna watched him ride away, they realized that their love story had become something larger than themselves. They were pioneers in a different kind of frontier, not the geographical one that most people associated with the American West, but the social and cultural frontier where understanding replaced fear, where love conquered prejudice, where two people could look past surface differences to see the soul beneath. Their cabin in the desert had become more than a home. It was a symbol of hope, a proof that change was possible, a living testament to the power of love to transform not just individuals, but entire communities. The broken cowboy and the scarred Apache woman had found their happy ending. But more importantly, they'd created a new beginning for themselves, for their community, and for everyone who believed that love could conquer all. 1 year after their wedding, Jake and Ayanna Morrison faced their greatest challenge yet. The autumn of 1882 brought news that would test everything they'd built together and threatened to destroy the fragile progress they'd helped create in the Arizona Territory. The trouble began with a letter delivered by a dust-covered rider who'd traveled 3 days to reach their remote cabin. Attorney Richardson's urgent message was brief but chilling. Federal investigation launched into territorial corruption. Your testimony needed immediately. Danger to both of you is real and immediate. Jake read the letter aloud to Ayanna as they sat at their breakfast table, the morning light streaming through windows that now held glass instead of oiled paper, one of many improvements they'd made to their home. Their comfortable domestic routine was about to be shattered by forces beyond their control. "They want us to testify against Whitmore and the others involved in the illegal detention scheme," Jake said, his voice tight with concern. "Richardson says it's the only way to ensure justice and prevent it from happening again." Ayanna set down her coffee cup with trembling hands. "And if we refuse, then other innocent people will suffer what you suffered. The system will continue, and men like Whitmore will keep profiting from human misery." The weight of the decision pressed down on them both. Testifying would mean traveling to the territorial capital, facing hostile questioning, and making themselves targets for anyone who profited from the corrupt system they'd helped expose. But staying silent would mean allowing the abuse to continue. "We have to do it," Ayanna said finally, though her voice carried the strain of someone who'd already suffered too much at the hands of those in power. "We have to speak for those who can't speak for themselves." Jake reached across the table to take her hand. "Are you sure? Once we do this, there's no going back. We'll have powerful enemies, people who want to silence us permanently." I've been silent for too long," Ayanna replied, her grip tightening on his fingers. "My grandmother used to say that the spirits of the ancestors grow restless when injustice goes unpunished. If we don't fight this, who will?" The journey to Phoenix took 5 days through terrain that grew increasingly hostile as they approached the territorial capital. Jake had procured a sturdy wagon and armed himself with both rifle and pistol. while Ayanna packed her medical supplies and enough food for the journey. They weren't traveling alone. Dr. Hayes and Father Santos had insisted on accompanying them, along with 3 other witnesses who'd agreed to testify despite the personal risks. The Phoenix of 1882 was a boomtown drunk on silver money and territorial politics, its streets filled with miners, merchants, politicians, and the kind of desperate men who always flocked to places where fortunes could be made or lost overnight. The federal courthouse sat at the center of town like a monument to justice, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. "Stay close to me," he murmured to Toyana as they made their way through the crowded streets toward the hotel where Richardson had arranged accommodations. "And keep your eyes open. Whitmore has friends here, and they won't be happy to see us." Their first night in Phoenix passed without incident, but the next morning brought disturbing news. The hotel clerk, a nervous man with darting eyes, informed them that certain parties had been asking about their arrival and expressing keen interest in their plans. "What kind of parties?" Jake asked, his hand instinctively moving to his gun belt. "The kind that don't like to see their business discussed in federal court," the clerk replied cryptically. "The kind that have long memories and short tempers." The federal courthouse was an imposing structure of red brick and granite, its columns and arches designed to inspire respect for the law. But as Jake and Ayanna climbed the steps that morning, they were more conscious of the hostile faces in the crowd than the building's architectural grandeur. "Look at that," someone called out from the gathering crowd. "The half-breed and her white husband, come to tell lies about decent folks. Ought to send them both back where they came from," another voice added. "This territory's got no place for their kind." Jake felt Ayanna's hand tighten on his arm, but when he looked at her face, he saw determination rather than fear. She walked with her head held high, her scars visible and proud, refusing to be intimidated by the hatred around them. The courtroom was packed with spectators, reporters, and interested parties from across the territory. Judge Harold Morrison, no relation to Jake, despite the shared surname, was a stern man with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. The federal prosecutor, a young attorney named David Chun, had traveled from San Francisco specifically for this case. "This trial," Judge Morrison announced as the proceedings began, "will determine whether systematic violations of federal law occurred in the detention and forced labor of Native American citizens. The court will hear testimony from multiple witnesses regarding these alleged violations." The first day of testimony established the scope of the conspiracy. Witness after witness described the illegal auctions, the forged documents, the brutal conditions in which Apache prisoners were held. Jake watched the jury's faces as they heard evidence of systematic abuse, seeing disgust and anger replace initial skepticism. When Jake's turn came to testify, he spoke clearly and directly about the auction where he'd first encountered Ayanna, the circumstances of her purchase, and the gradual discovery of the legal fraud behind the entire system. "You paid $5 for this woman," the defense attorney said during cross-examination, his tone suggesting something unsavory. "What exactly were you expecting to get for your money?" "I was expecting to help someone who needed help," Jake replied firmly. "I saw a human being being treated like livestock and I couldn't stand by and watch it happen." "But you didn't free her immediately. You took her home with you, had her work for you, shared living quarters with her." "That doesn't sound like helping, that sounds like taking advantage." Jake felt his temper rising but forced himself to remain calm. "I offered her freedom from the first day. She chose to stay because she had nowhere else to go. We became partners, then friends, then husband and wife. Every step of the way, it was her choice." "Her choice?" The defense attorney's voice dripped with skepticism. "An Apache woman with no money, no legal status, scarred by fire and rejected by her own people, what choice did she really have?" "She chose to trust me," Jake said, his voice steady despite the provocation. "She chose to believe that not all white men were her enemies. She chose to build a life with someone who saw her worth when others saw only damage. The defense attorney's questioning continued for hours, trying to paint Jake as either a fool or a predator. But Jake's honest answers and obvious love for his wife gradually won over the jury. When he finally stepped down from the witness stand, he felt drained but confident that he'd told the truth effectively. Then it was Ayana's turn to testify, and the real battle began. She walked to the witness stand with the same dignity she'd shown throughout their relationship, her head held high despite the hostile murmurs from the crowd. When she raised her right hand to swear to tell the truth, her voice was clear and strong. "Please state your name for the record," Prosecutor Chun said gently. "Ayana Morrison," she replied, and Jake felt a surge of pride at the way she claimed both her Apache heritage and her married name. "Mrs. Morrison, can you tell the court about the circumstances that led to your detention and eventual sale at auction?" Ayana's testimony was devastating. She described the illegal raid on her village, the murder of her family, the months of imprisonment without trial or legal representation. She spoke of the forged documents, the brutal conditions, the systematic dehumanization of Apache prisoners. "They told us we were criminals," she said, her voice carrying across the packed courtroom. "They told us we had no rights, no legal standing, no hope of freedom. They told us we were lucky to be alive, that we should be grateful for whatever scraps of mercy they chose to give us." "And did you believe them?" Chun asked. "At first, yes. When you're hungry and afraid and everyone around you treats you like an animal, you start to believe that's what you are. You start to accept that maybe you deserve whatever happens to you." "What changed your mind?" Ayana looked directly at Jake, her scarred face radiant with love and gratitude. "I met someone who saw me as a human being. Someone who treated me with dignity and respect, who showed me that I had value beyond my usefulness as a laborer. Someone who proved that love is stronger than hate, that courage is more powerful than fear." The defense attorney's cross-examination was brutal, designed to discredit Ayana's testimony by attacking her character, her background, her very humanity. He questioned her intelligence, her morality, her right to speak in an American court. But with each attack, Ayana's responses grew stronger, more dignified, more powerful. "You claim to have been illegally detained," the defense attorney said, his voice dripping with contempt. "But isn't it true that you were a hostile Apache, part of a group that had been raiding American settlements?" "I was a healer," Ayana replied calmly. "I gathered medicinal plants and cared for the sick. I had never raised a weapon against anyone." "But you were Apache. Your people were at war with the United States government. Some Apache were at war," Ayana corrected. "Our village was peaceful. We had treaties with the territorial government. We were living according to those treaties when the soldiers came. Treaties that your people repeatedly violated. Treaties that were violated by men who wanted our land." Ayana interrupted, her voice rising with righteous anger. "Men who found it easier to label us all as criminals than to honor the agreements they had made." The exchange continued for hours, with the defense attorney trying every possible angle to undermine Ayana's credibility. But her truth was too powerful, her dignity too evident, her suffering too real to be dismissed. When she finally stepped down from the witness stand, the courtroom was dead silent. Even the hostile crowd seemed moved by her testimony, by the quiet strength with which she'd faced her tormentors. That evening, back at their hotel, Jake and Ayana received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Hayes knocked on their door with news that made Jake's blood run cold. "Whitmore's been seen in town," he said without preamble. "He's got men with him, and they're not here to observe the trial. Richardson thinks they might try to prevent you from testifying further." Jake felt Ayana's hand tighten on his arm. "What do you mean?" "I mean they might try to hurt you. To silence you permanently. Richardson's arranged for federal marshals to provide protection, but you need to be extremely careful." The threat was real and immediate. As they prepared for bed that night, Jake and Ayanna both knew that their fight for justice had put them in mortal danger. But they also knew that backing down now would mean betraying everyone who'd suffered under the corrupt system they were helping to expose. "Are you scared?" Jake asked as they lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the rowdy town outside their window. "Terrified," Ayanna admitted, "but also proud. We're doing something important, something that matters. If we die tomorrow, at least we'll die knowing we stood up for what was right." Jake pulled her closer, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest. "We're not going to die," he said firmly. "We're going to see this through, and we're going to win. Justice is going to triumph, and people like Whitmore are going to pay for what they've done." Outside their window, the night was full of shadows and unknown dangers. But inside their hotel room, two people who'd found love in the most unlikely circumstances held each other close and prepared to face whatever morning would bring. The trial was far from over, and the most dangerous moments still lay ahead. But Jake and Ayanna Morrison had faced impossible odds before and emerged victorious. They would do so again, no matter what it cost them. 20-5 years after Jake Morrison paid $5 for what he thought was a damaged woman at an illegal auction, he stood on the porch of their expanded home, watching his granddaughter play in the garden that had grown from Ayanna's first tentative plantings into a thriving oasis. The little girl had her grandmother's dark eyes and her grandfather's stubborn determination, and she was carefully tending to the medicinal plants that had become the foundation of the Morrison family's reputation throughout the territory. "Grandmama," 8-year-old Maria called out, her voice carrying the musical quality that seemed to run in their family. "The desert willow is blooming again. Does that mean someone's going to fall in love?" Ayanna, now 53 and more beautiful than ever despite the silver threading through her black hair, smiled as she joined her granddaughter among the flowers. "Perhaps, little one. Or perhaps it just means the desert is happy." Jake watched his wife with the same wonder he'd felt that first day when she'd removed the burlap sack. The scars were still there, would always be there, but they'd become part of her story rather than defining it. She was Dr. Ayanna Morrison now, the first licensed Apache physician in the Arizona Territory, a woman whose reputation for healing extended far beyond their small community. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had taken years of study, mentorship under Dr. Hayes, and countless battles with medical boards who questioned whether a Native American woman could truly understand modern medicine. But Ayanna had persisted, combining traditional Apache healing practices with contemporary medical knowledge to create something entirely new and remarkably effective. "Tell me the story again, Grandpapa," Maria said, abandoning her gardening to climb onto Jake's lap. "About how you and Grandmama met." Jake had told this story hundreds of times over the years, but it never lost its power to move him. "Well," he began, settling into the familiar rhythm of the tale, "it was a very hot day in August, and I was the loneliest man in the whole Arizona Territory." As he spoke, other members of their extended family gathered around. His son Thomas, now 32, and a respected attorney like his mentor Richardson, sat with his wife Elena, a Mexican woman whose own family had faced discrimination before finding acceptance in the Morrison community. Their daughter Sarah, 28, and following in her mother's footsteps as a healer, listened with her husband David, a former soldier who'd learned to see past his military training to embrace the Morrison family's values of inclusion. Peace. The family had grown not just through birth and marriage, but through adoption and choice. Over the years, Jake and Ayanna had taken in dozens of children, Apache orphans, abandoned mixed-race children, white children whose parents had died in the harsh frontier conditions. Each one had been loved, educated, and taught the values that had guided the Morrison family from its unlikely beginning. "The best part of the story," Maria announced solemnly, "is when Grandpapa cried because Grandmama was so beautiful. I still Cry sometimes, Jake admitted, pulling his granddaughter closer. Happy tears, because I still can't believe how lucky I am. The community that had grown around their initial act of sharing water had become something unprecedented in the American West. The town of Morrison Creek, named for the couple who discovered the spring, was home to Anglo families, Apache families, Mexican families, Chinese families, and freed slaves, all living together in relative harmony. It wasn't perfect. There were still conflicts, still prejudices to overcome, still people who couldn't accept the idea of racial equality. But it worked better than anyone had thought possible. The secret to their success lay in the principles Jake and Ayanna had established from the beginning: mutual respect, shared resources, and the understanding that everyone's contribution mattered. The town had its own school where children learned in English, Spanish, and Apache. It had a clinic where traditional and modern medicine worked hand in hand. It had a governing council that included representatives from all communities. Remember, Ayanna said, as she always did when the story reached its end, the most important part isn't that we fell in love. It's that we chose to keep loving every day, even when it was difficult, even when people were mean to you. Maria asked. Especially then, Jake replied. Because love isn't just a feeling, sweetheart. It's a choice you make every single day. A choice to see the best in people, to help when you can, to fight for what's right even when it's hard. As the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in the brilliant colors that had become as familiar as breathing, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The broken cowboy who'd bought a woman at auction had become a respected community leader, a man whose opinion carried weight throughout the territory. The scarred Apache woman who'd believed herself worthless had become a doctor, a teacher, a mother, and a grandmother whose legacy would outlive them all. Their children had grown up to be leaders in their own right. Thomas had become the territory's first mixed-race judge, appointed despite considerable opposition because his legal mind and moral character were undeniable. Sarah had founded the Morrison Institute for Traditional Medicine, a school that trained healers from multiple cultural backgrounds. Their youngest, adopted son Michael, had become a rancher who employed sustainable practices that worked with the desert rather than against it. But perhaps their greatest achievement was the simple proof that love could triumph over prejudice, that families could be built on choice rather than blood, that communities could thrive when they embraced diversity rather than fearing it. I have something to show you, Ayanna said, disappearing into the house and returning with a worn leather journal. I've been writing down our story, all of it, from the beginning to now. I want future generations to understand how we got here, what we fought for, why it mattered. Jake took the journal, his weathered hands gentle with the precious pages. You wrote it all down? Every important moment, Ayanna replied. The good and the bad, the victories and the defeats. I want people to understand that change doesn't happen overnight, that building a better world takes time and effort and the willingness to fail and try again. As Maria curled up between her grandparents, Jake began to read aloud from the journal. The words brought back memories of that first auction, of their tentative courtship, of the challenges they'd faced and overcome together. But more than that, they told the story of a community that had learned to see past surface differences to the humanity beneath. Will you read the whole thing? Maria asked sleepily. Maybe not all tonight, Jake said with a smile. But I'll read as much as you want to hear. As the stars emerged in the vast Arizona sky, 3 generations of the Morrison family sat together on the porch, connected by love and sustained by hope. The story that had begun with $5 and a desperate act of compassion had become something much larger, a testament to the power of love to heal wounds, bridge divides, and create something beautiful from the most unlikely circumstances. In the distance, a night bird called out, not mournfully, but with the clear, strong voice of something that belonged exactly where it was. The sound carried across the desert, reaching other families, other communities, other people who were still learning that love was stronger than fear, that unity was more powerful than division, that a better world was possible if people were willing to work for it. Jake Morrison had paid $5 for what he thought was a damaged woman, and had received instead a lifetime of love, a family beyond his wildest dreams, and the satisfaction of knowing that his life had made a difference. The investment had paid dividends he could never have imagined, creating wealth that couldn't be measured in dollars, but in the lives touched, the prejudices overcome, and the hope kindled in hearts that had almost given up on humanity. As the final chapter of their story closed, Jake and Ayanna knew that their legacy would continue in their children, their grandchildren, and everyone who chose to believe that love could conquer all. The lonely cowboy and the Apache woman with the covered face had found their happy ending, but more importantly, they had created countless new beginnings for others, who would follow in their footsteps. The desert wind whispered through the garden, carrying with it the scent of desert flowers and the promise of tomorrow. And somewhere in that wind, if you listened carefully, you could hear the echo of an old Apache blessing. May you bloom where you are planted, and may your love be a light that guides others home. The story was complete, but the love that had created it would last forever, passed down through generations who would carry forward the simple but revolutionary truth that Jake and Ayanna Morrison had discovered together, that every person has worth, that every heart deserves love, and that the most beautiful things in life often come disguised as the most broken. Under the star-filled sky of the Arizona Territory, the family that had begun with an act of desperate compassion continued to grow, to love, and to prove that sometimes the best investments are the ones that pay off not in gold, but in the gold of human connection, understanding, and hope. Their story would be told for generations to come, inspiring others to look past surface differences to the precious humanity beneath, to choose love over fear, and to remember that $5 spent on compassion could change the world, one heart, one family, one community at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.